Welcome everybody, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Eric Sims, I'm the Sustainability Director here in Concord. And we're here tonight because we wanted to share some information and solicit some input, feedback from folks about the process that we've been working on towards pursuing an energy savings performance contract, possibly for Concord, for the town, for our buildings and facilities. So we wanted to give you some updates as part of that, let you know where we are in the process and give you an opportunity to have some input, feedback, and provide any questions. So there's a few other people I wanted to mention that have joined us tonight that are here. So Russ Karlstad's here. Russ is our facilities manager for the town. He's worked with me on trying to advance this effort. And we also have Chris Schnappner, who's here with us. Chris is a Concord resident. He is also the CEO of Green Engineer, which is a sustainable design consulting firm. And so he has a lot of background in energy issues and is familiar with a lot of things. So we have him here to help us as an asset and resource as we're talking about this topic. And we also have some representatives from our town council who are here who have also been working with us on the draft of the RFQ. So we have Jessica Wall here, and I think one of our colleagues will be joining us in a couple of minutes once we get past traffic. And this is largely was intended to be an internal, we're calling an internal stakeholders meeting. So we've identified some key stakeholders as part of this process. Some obvious ones like the select board, finance committee, our finance department, our municipal light plan, our schools and our school committee, and our climate action committee, who all have a stake and a say in this effort and what we're doing. So we certainly want to bring them together, and then of course other members of the public and who are interested in this topic and would like to know what's going on. So what I wanted to do first was take a few minutes to just provide a little bit of background. Some of you may already know some of this, having heard me talk a little bit about this before. For others of you, it might be a little bit more new. So I just want to kind of take a couple of minutes to sort of set the stage and the context for what it is that we're trying to do here. Okay, so first I want to identify what the need is. So why exactly are we doing this? Well, we really need to look strategically at how we invest in our municipal buildings. We haven't really done many major projects in a while. We've had some turnover of facilities in recent years. And so there's a need there to look at our buildings. There's projects. We have deferred maintenance, things that are happening presently, and then we also need to look at the future for maintenance and operations around our buildings. We certainly want to see what we can do to capture any additional energy efficiency in our municipal buildings as we look at projects and things that need to be done, maintenance. From a sustainability perspective, we certainly also want to look at opportunities for decarbonizing our municipal buildings, so how do we continue to move away from the use of fossil fuels in our buildings and in our building systems. We want to make sure that the people in those buildings are in healthy and comfortable environments, so that there's equipment and buildings that are supporting them with that. And then we also want to look at operational efficiency. We're a small town, we have a relatively small facility staff, so how can we look at how we can maximize the efficiency of that staff in our building operations. One of the things that we have been talking about for a little while here in town that relates to all this is the need to conduct some investment-grade energy audits for our buildings. So this is an idea that came up a little while back, and what that would involve is looking across all of our buildings and collecting detailed data about our buildings and their energy use, looking at how we can model energy use in those buildings, look at financial analysis around the systems that are currently in those buildings, and then what replacement systems might work and what that would cost us, both in the near and long term. What the risks might be that are associated with switching out systems or going in certain directions with these efforts. And then, of course, looking at capital investments. So looking down the road, how do we better plan in terms of how we're going to invest and what we're going to do. And so getting a baseline data, baseline information about that through audits is a first key step. And that's something, as I said, we've been talking about doing for a little while. Originally, the thought was that we have money budgeted to sort of do that independently, so just hire a consultant who would be able to do that for us. We're originally looking at ARPA funds as a solution for that, and initially there was an amount of $100,000 that had been set aside. I think that was probably maybe 2 budget cycles ago, to be able to look at doing that. So when I came on, I started looking at that more closely. At the time, we were without a facilities director for a little while, so I started doing some investigating, and within that, came across another potential pathway of getting these investment-grade energy audits done, and that was through an energy savings performance contract, or an ESPC. And in this instance, I'll get into exactly what that is in just a minute or two. But through a contract like this, doing investment-grade audits are a part of that process, and they can be integrated into the contract without having upfront costs. So there's no immediate need for funds to be able to do that. So how does an energy savings performance contract work? Well, this goes back to Chapter 25A in the state, which is focused on energy management services. If I got this correct, I believe that was started back in 2008. So this isn't a new concept here in Massachusetts. But the intent behind Chapter 25A was to streamline procurement and contracting for energy management services for municipalities. So the state provided pathways to encourage municipalities to invest in energy efficiency and address a lot of capital needs that they have. Within that, one of the pieces of that is the idea of contracting with an energy services company or an ESCO for these energy savings performance contracts. And this is just a very high-level sort of description of how these work. I already mentioned the investment-grade energy audits that are done is one of the first steps in that. So looking across our buildings and facilities to get baseline information about what's there, what's working, what's not working, where is there potential. By looking at that, the energy services company identifies and evaluates a suite of opportunities for improvements across those facilities. And typically they're referred to as energy conservation measures. So for any given building or facility, you can say, oh, looks like this HVAC system is on its way out, needs to be replaced within this time frame, and here's some options for doing that that would realize some energy savings, potentially cost savings along with that. The energy services company leads the process from development all the way through implementation. And this is really one of the big benefits of a contract like this, is that it streamlines procurement. So this focuses on a design build process versus a design bid build. So you're able to bundle a number of projects under a single contract, and get those done in a much more efficient manner than you would having to go out to bid for every single project that you do. And of course, there's some other pieces depending on the size of the project, the size, scale, cost of the project, that you can potentially streamline things too, but this sort of captures everything in one shot. Continuing with that, with what these are, the contract commits the energy services company to install the necessary equipment based on recommendations and approval of those recommendations by us in the form of a contract. So they install the equipment, and as part of that, they provide a performance guarantee. So they say, if you follow our recommendations, we agree on this, we are going to guarantee a certain level of performance and energy savings to you. The contract also establishes the terms of any upfront or ongoing payments, and ideally, under this type of contract, those payments are intended to be less than the long-term financial savings that are realized by the projects that are included within the contract. So the contracts are typically 15 to 20 years, and the reason for the length of those contracts is to have enough time to be able to actually capture those savings. So the ESCO takes on the technical risk, and the client being us. We use loans or capital leases and or equity that we have to pay our fees to the ESCO and or the bank, and manage to net any differences that are there. So overall, the contract provides the ESCO with a reliable source of revenue, and we as the client get guaranteed energy savings. You can just kind of see this little infographic there that kind of outlines that a little bit, just the basic process. This just shows what some of the typical improvements are that are historically often captured under these types of contracts. You can see it ranges a good bit. I think when we think of energy savings, we're often thinking of buildings and heating and cooling systems, and that's certainly a part of that. But there's also a lot of other elements within building systems that are involved in this. But it also includes water conservation and energy savings related to water and water conservation. Things like wastewater treatment plant. So there's a lot of different potential pathways here for energy savings that we can capture. And I guess I should mention as part of this too, and this is part of the larger discussion we've been having around pursuing a contract like this, is the fact that here in Concord, we've already realized some of these energy savings. So things like LED lighting, we pretty much probably already captured most of the savings in that. Everything from street lights to most of our municipal buildings, if not all of them, now using LED lighting. So there's some things that have already been realized, and obviously if you're looking at the overall picture of energy savings in terms of a contract, there may be some of that lower hanging fruit that we've already realized that wouldn't necessarily be included in a contract like this for us. So I just want to touch on what this type of model, this type of contract can allow us to do based on what some of our needs are here in Concord. As I mentioned when I kicked things off, our approach, similar to many other towns over the years, has often been much more of an ad hoc, project by project approach to buildings. If we know something is going to need to be replaced, or if something breaks and needs to be replaced, we're responding to that. We're doing the best we can to replace systems, deal with issues, try to stay ahead of things, which isn't always easy when you're looking at budget and staffing resources and capital planning and all those kind of things. So a contract like this allows us to look across all of our buildings in a much more comprehensive, forward way to think about how we can plan, looking out 5-10 more years to where we need to be and how we want to capitalize on our investments. That in this case, that includes our school buildings. So again, like many other communities, there's a little bit of a disconnect here in Concord between school buildings and other municipal buildings in terms of who makes decisions around those buildings. There's a school committee meeting this evening, so school leadership and school committee members were invited here today as well. They obviously have that obligation tonight. But we have had conversations with them, and they have expressed their strong interest in being a part of this process. This is something to move forward with, which is terrific. And that kind of goes down to the third point there about potential energy savings. That's terrific because the school buildings probably offer some of our biggest opportunities for energy savings here in town, not surprisingly. If you look at our energy use data that we report each year as the Green Communities Program, out of the top 10 buildings, pretty much all the school buildings are within that top 10 every year, but they just happen to be our biggest buildings and they use a lot of energy. Some people may say, well, our school buildings aren't necessarily that old compared to other communities, but they're in the 20 to 25 year range as they're approaching a number of them, then they're probably going to be reaching end of life for a number of their systems, and there should be opportunities there as we look at larger system replacements to potentially take advantage of that. I already mentioned the benefit of streamlining procurement. So again, that can take a lot of time and energy. So the idea of being able to have this contract where the energy services company is going to do project scoping and bid and implementation and management, that really helps us out in terms of staff time and resources. I say potential for energy savings. I mentioned before that there are some lower hanging fruit that we've already taken advantage of, but I think would be interesting as part of this process through the audits, to determine just where the potential is for us to realize additional energy savings. And again, it may not be quite as high in some areas compared to some other communities, but I think the potential is still there. And of course, with energy savings comes the potential for cost savings. Can't say much specific about that until we get further along in the process and look at what some of the opportunities are that come out from the audits and the potential contract. And then, of course, from the perspective of sustainability and our Climate Action Committee, we certainly want to be looking at opportunities as part of an effort like this. And if there is a larger contract for, where's the possibility for continued decarbonization of our municipal buildings and supporting our sustainability goals as part of our Climate Action Plan. And then from Russ's perspective, from facilities, there's a lot of opportunity across our municipal buildings for improving our building management systems, bringing those together across buildings with much newer technologies. There's a lot of room for improvement there. As I mentioned before, just ultimately, improving the experience for the occupants of all of our buildings. So where are we right now? Well, I know you can't read this, kind of small, but I wanted to make sure I fit this whole chart in here because this is sort of an outline of the entire process from start to, 20 years from now. So where we are right now is where you see that red arrow. We're still up there in what's considered phase 1, the project preparation. So we've been trying to do our homework and our diligence. And part of this is having us draft and issue a solicitation for an energy services company and a contract. And that's what we've been working on most recently is drafting a request for qualifications, an RFQ. So we feel like we have a fairly solid draft at this point, and I shared that draft with those of you who are on or staff or on committees. So you've seen a version of that draft already, and although it's fairly lengthy and somewhat dense at times, it gives you a sense of what's included in that. I'll mention that the Department of Energy Resources for the state, when this program was developed, in Chapter 25, they came up with a model request for proposals and also a model request for qualifications. There's any number of communities who've used that model to develop their own that they've used to go out to bid. The one that we have modeled ours on fairly closely is from Salem. They did an RFQ in 2022. So we've largely, looking across a number of different examples, that seemed like a really solid one for us to try to base ours on and go with, which is the draft that I've shared. So it's based on Salem as well as the DOER model. So the end of phase 1, the project preparation phase, which is the top there, would result in us selecting a qualified vendor. So at this point, we're anxious to get some final feedback on the draft RFQ. We'd like to get that process moving as quickly as we can to get that out and be able to get responses to that as soon as possible. And that's, again, part of what this meeting is about, and sharing that with the community is hear what you think of that, and whether you have any concerns around that. Looking forward, once we were able to select a vendor, the next phase 2 there is the development of the actual contract. And the beginning of that, the orange squares are contract points in the process, the blue squares are tasks, and the green squares are deliverables. So that first step in the development is having a contract for those investment grade audits and completing those audits. So then that involves data collection, a preliminary energy audit that's developed, and then having the vendor come up with this whole suite of energy conservation measures across all of our buildings and facilities. That's all put together as a report. We as a town look at that report, kind of go back and forth, negotiate around that. If we're all comfortable with that, the next step would be to sign off on that and then move forward to the contract phase, which is contract 2, and that's actually the energy management services agreement, so that's the actual contract. I should also mention that the first contract to do the investment grade audits, a standard part of that process is that communities, once they've done the investment grade audits, have the option to bow out, if you will, step away. So if the investment grade audits are done And if for some reason we didn't really like what the vendor was suggesting to us in terms of a contract, we have the legal option of saying, thank you very much for doing those audits for us. We're going to cut you a check and we're going to go on our way and do our own thing. I don't hear that happening too often based on other communities I've talked to, but it is there and it is a possibility to sort of stop the process there. But moving on, when we move to the contract, if we move forward with that, then we go into the phase 3, which is design build, where we really start to put the projects in place and implement those, and start chipping away at all those energy conservation measures that are part of that. And then option 3, which I think there is some interest from us, is operations and maintenance agreement, which is optional, but can be part of it as well. So having a vendor sort of help support the town in terms of continued operations and maintenance of the equipment and the systems that are put in place. And then, of course, part of all this is also measurement validation. So the vendor is required by contract to continually monitor the progress and make sure that the energy savings that they have guaranteed are actually being delivered. If they aren't delivered, then they're on the hook to make up a difference to us if it's in terms of costs. And so that's where I was planning to end my sort of overview. Again, I know that might be a little bit new to some of you and a little old hat to others. But like I said, we're at this point we're really interested in moving forward with the request for qualifications. One of the first steps once we have that in place is to send a copy of that to the Department of Energy Resources, where they will review it, make sure they're comfortable with it, and their council is comfortable with it, and then if that all goes well, we can publish it, advertise it, and hopefully get a vendor lined up if that's the way we choose to go. So what I want to do now is just give a few minutes. I mentioned that we've been working with our town council, who have had eyes on this draft RFQ and have helped us with some of the language. We had got some earlier feedback from the Climate Action Committee about a desire to make sure that the town's commitment to decarbonization and electrification of our buildings is included and represented in the RFQ. So we've taken a stab at including some of that language, and I'll let council talk a little bit more about that, but we're optimistic that the edits that we've included around that would not be objectionable to DOER once they review it. But again, traditionally these are considered energy savings contracts, and we're suggesting more of an energy savings and emissions reduction contract. So with that, I'll invite Jess Wall to come up and maybe just for a couple minutes just talk a little bit more about the RFQ, recognizing some of you may have seen it, some of you may have not, but just talking about that a little bit more in terms of how that fits into our process.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. I'm Jess Wall from Anderson & Krieger. I'm going to keep Eric's very helpful slide up here to answer questions because this is a multi-step process. So I can just provide a little bit more context and a little bit of a gloss. I think Eric put together a really helpful slideshow about all these different pieces and details. What I think of this contract setup as doing is really offering the town quite a bit of flexibility in terms of what you want to do. So one thing to recognize about the RFQ process as opposed to the RFP process is that you don't have to make major decisions now. There's sort of a version of this contracting process that sees you through 15 or 20 years, depending on what you want to do. But right now, at this moment, what you're doing is trying to find the right person who's going to help you through that process. So once we do that, and I can talk a little bit about what that might look like and sort of next steps. Ultimately, you'll have a contract for a short term, for a period of time, with the person you've selected, the qualified vendor you've selected to help you, and then that will result in the investment grade audits that Eric was referencing. So once you have those, you can take a look at them and decide, we have a lot of different options, these are the priority projects that we want to pursue, whatever it might be, and then there is something you'll see a little bit in the that slide to the left, there's something called a break fee. So that's the concept that if you saw something in an audit and you thought, no, this project isn't quite so much of a priority, we only want to move forward with these, that you could do that to compensate the vendor for their work, but then not necessarily move forward. Otherwise, if you do proceed with the project, the idea is that the savings and the cost of doing the audit get sort of baked into a longer term agreement for the life of the building. So as a town, Concord has done so many wonderful things. I was through your Sustainable Concord report. You all recognize that buildings emissions and the built environment are a significant percentage of greenhouse gas impact. So Eric and I talked about pulling in the sort of emissions reduction and concept into this RFQ, which I think is totally relevant. I think what the audit will help you do is get a sense of a baseline for particular buildings, and then based on that, you can figure out where you want to target your energy and contracting and cost savings. One other thing that I'll just mention in terms of next steps, and those of you who saw the draft might have had a chance to see this, part of the RFQ will include a list of potential buildings that we would want to be subject to the audit. So we've asked and listed in the RFQ a couple of examples for a bidder to sort of show us your stuff and what ideas you might have, so we have a sense of their qualifications and experience in this arena. And then ultimately we would probably pick some manageable number of buildings that we would actually want to see as an audit that then would get seen through this process. So you wouldn't want to do so many buildings in those audits that you're going to do a whole lot of audit work and then not necessarily go anywhere with it. So that's a little bit of a balancing thing that we can think about and weigh. But that's one piece of it, is selecting the particular buildings that we want to focus on. And then the other piece is figuring out who, I'm guessing some folks from in this room would want to be a part of a selection committee to sort of look at what we're seeing, to weigh in, to interview applicants, that sort of thing. And that's a sort of multi-stakeholder process. The success of these projects, I think, really comes down to the right people from the team all having input. So it's facilities, it's people who really know the operations of particular buildings. It's people with expertise in engineering and sustainable design. So I think there are lots of opportunities for different voices to play into the development of this. So Eric did a really great job covering. I had my notes and was looking through Eric's slides and thought, he's really covered quite a bit. I'm happy to answer questions about the particular document that we have. There's the RFQ. We tried to be pretty prescriptive about exactly what we wanted to see so that folks are really clear about that. And then at the end, we attached a sample investment grade audit agreement so that bidders understand what's really looking for and what would be expected of them. For the later on components that are a 15-year or 20-year contract, that I think is just a little bit beyond the scope of what we would want to do at this point, and that's a document that we need to get developed. The financing and the shared savings and all of those pieces down the road, I think are, we'd have to do separately. But what DOER is trying to do in this procurement process is really give towns some flexibility to do what they need to do, and understanding that a lot of these energy improvements and emissions reductions are big capital costs that would be really difficult for towns to manage otherwise, potentially, or make some tough decision making. So what this is allowing us to do is find the right person. That person will guide us through the process, give us some options, and then we'll figure out ultimately what bigger projects make sense for those longer term periods. So yeah, I'm happy to answer questions, Eric. I don't know if you have.
Well, yeah, I'll invite Chris. We invited you here. Somebody with some energy background. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I also don't know if you feel like there's anything we've overlooked or missed that we should be mentioning or discussing.
Well, I'm interested to see what the questions are that come up. I think one of my key points about this. Sorry, I get mics that people. So I don't think you mentioned my introduction. I am on the light board.
Yes.
But I think one of the interesting pieces is that the typical ESCO model is set up with the idea that the energy savings pays for the cost of the improvements. And so that's true when, you know, we're reducing the amount of electricity we're using or the amount of gas, but when we are doing decarbonization and fuel switching, we're not necessarily going to generate any savings. So then having a mechanism that you can potentially fund improvements in emissions instead, I think is an interesting piece of what that contract 2 might end up looking like. The other thing we talked about on the prep call that we did, that I think is a useful point, is just to understand what comes out of an audit. And so typically in those investment grade audits, they will look at ECMs, energy conservation measures, and they'll group them into roughly 3 buckets. So there will be what we would call low cost and no cost measures. Those are things that you could just do today. And it's, you know, maybe something as simple as making sure your thermostats are correct. Okay. I don't know.
Aim it this way.
Aim it this way,
Yeah.
and you can hear me, all right. So there you go. It's a directional microphone, not me apparently. So the low cost, no cost measures are things that you would just want to go do. It might be something as simple as programming thermostats, making sure they've got a time schedule and things like that. And then you'll identify things that can be standalone retrofit projects. So that a typical example would be lighting upgrades, right? You replace your old light fixtures with LEDs, you've already done that. But that kind of project will have a pretty quick payback. So it's, you know, 5-7 year type thing, and that fits very well into this model. And then there are going to be things that the audits are going to identify that are going to be more long-term, harder to do as a standalone project. And that would look at ultimately things like complete replacements of systems and significant building envelope upgrades. So thinking about those different types of interventions and how they come through this process, it might not be that you can get all of those all done under this contract, but I think just having the audits will give you a lot of information and give you a very good path for longer term planning, so that you're not just reacting when something breaks, but instead having a plan so that when it's time to replace something. And you know, to your point about the schools, 20 years is a pretty typical lifespan for mechanical equipment. So if you've got schools that are 15, 20, 25 years old, you want to be thinking about those things right now. So that when it breaks, you have a plan to put the thing you want in instead of just putting back what you had because you got to get to work today.
Yeah, Chris, just one thing that I'll add to that, your comment made me think of it, you know, part of what you might want to consider is what types of buildings, right? So to the schools example, if you're building a brand new school or, you know, a brand new building, that building is going to have, like, for LEED compliance or for whatever other reasons, like, that might not be something that, or, you know, certain building codes, stretch codes and whatnot. That building might already be like something that you don't necessarily want to worry about, or somebody building that project is already thinking about those issues more broadly. But smaller buildings, for example, where you think they're going to be around for a long time, or they have some sort of custom historic factor or value that you want to preserve, like, there are a lot of different options for how you might proceed and what kind of buildings you might want to target.
I had a few questions about how this is funded. So you said they could get paid by cutting a check if you just want to get their assessment and then walk away from them, or they walk away from us. But if we choose to contract with them, do we then pay them another check, or do they take a cut of the savings that we experience?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the selected vendor would create the audits, would do that work. And if we decided that we did not want to move forward with that next stage of contracting, at that point, there would be what's called a break fee. And that's something that we need to refine a little bit more, what that break fee would look like ahead of time, so that it's very clear to everybody that if we don't proceed with, move forward with the audit for building X, that the vendor will be compensated for their time. If we do decide that we want to move forward with further upgrades to that building in that longer term contract, then we would not actually have to pay a fee for the audit itself. but the value of the audit, the cost of the audit would probably be absorbed into that longer term contract where you're trying to, that's really looking at like sort of the shared savings of the building. So the way that the ESCO ultimately gets, or the contractor ultimately gets paid is through shared savings typically, but that can vary a lot depending on the programs that are at play with the remedies that are ultimately selected for the building.
This sounds very interesting, because you've got the two parties kind of negotiating with each other. When I've done a lot of renovations on my house, I always get a few bids or a few estimates. And I always get ideas. So there'll be a couple outliers, but there'll be a convergence of opinion. So if you go through the audit process, you're in effect picking their brains. And I'm just wondering how long they let that process go before they just put a stop to it. But anyway, if you do contract with them for a while, what are the durations that you can do this for? Because I can imagine, they may want you to stick around for 15 or 20 years, but who knows what'll be going on then? It could be quite different. So, on the other hand, and what do they have different percents of savings that they would share in? I don't know if I said that right, but and are there I guess you look into their track records in other towns, see how that's all worked. And I would wonder if you could sort of, like, if they have an option to do it for 5 years, and if you like them, you can sign on for another 5 years, which might cost slightly more than if you'd done 10 in the first place, but, these people might, who knows? It's a very interesting model.
Yeah, no, these are all very good questions, and I'm excited that you think it's interesting, because anytime someone talks about renewable energy law is interesting, I'm just excited.
Well, I know something, it sounds very much like something that is done in healthcare that I know something more about, which is why I'm very curious to hear about it down here.
So I want to make sure I answer the different parts of your question. So you talked about length of contract, and that can vary. I think that depends on what you're actually trying to make happen in a particular building. The statute provides that it can't be longer than 20 years, and I think that's really just sort of an outside rule of reason. There might be reasons why you don't want a 20-year contract, or you just don't want this like obligation sticking around, and that's okay. 20 years is like a term that we often see associated with power purchase agreements or renewable projects. So that, I think what that's trying to do is provide some outside parameter for towns to think about that. But it could be much shorter. You could say that for a building you want a smaller scope of upgrades and you want a shorter contract, and the savings are going to be realized sooner. So that's all very much in the mix. I think you also had a question about savings, about like what percentages are fair as among folks, and so that I think also is going to vary. There's no standard number necessarily. I think it'll depend on what you want to actually happen at that particular site, what state or federal rebates or refunds might be available. There's all kinds of different ways to slice it. And then I feel like I'm forgetting the last part of your question.
It was duration, percent of savings, track record with various other towns, and, if it were me, I'd do 5 years, see how it went. I test run,
Yes.
see,
So part
take
of
the
what
worst building and give it to, and say, what can you guys do with this?
So part of what we're asking for in the RFQ is we want to know what the track record is, and we get to call references. We want to hear everything about the good, the bad. We might do our own sort of recon about this, like all of this is public about what's out there. That will very much come into play. And yeah, I think there's lots of different variations to consider about.
And how long has this kind of thing been going on? If you're thinking about track record, they only started it like 10 or 15 years ago. There's not much track record to go on.
More than you think. So there's a fair amount of information out there from other vendors and other towns. And DOER actually helps as a resource sometimes for this because they have eyes on a bigger cross section of things than other people necessarily do. part of the trade-off with the procurement process is that because we're not going through traditional procurement, we sort of check in more with DOER, and that's a way for them to make sure that nothing unusual is going on, but also they get to provide a little bit of context sometimes. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Well, I'll add that this particular program and the laws of the state of Massachusetts go back to 2008. The ESCO model and performance contracting goes back many, many more years before that. It was it's been very active in the private sector really since the 1980s, I would say at least. So it's been around for a long time. Just one other piece on the duration part. Part of what determines the duration of that contract is how quickly you're getting savings back, right? Because you've got the idea is you're paying for the upfront cost with the savings. So it's something that takes a long time to pay back. You're going to have a longer contract to pay back.
I agree.
I was wondering, how can you effectively evaluate the savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to just plain cost? So, I mean, if you put in your gas boiler, you can be saving energy, but you might be putting out almost as much greenhouse gas. So how do you evaluate that? And how, what's the cost savings over time in doing these things? Because one might be more expensive to put in the first place, and what are the benefits in the long term?
So I think this is a really good question. We incorporated the emissions concept into the RFQ because I think really to get a holistic picture, you need to know both about what's going on from an energy perspective, from cost, from use, but then also about building emissions. The energy piece of it is a lot easier to quantify and say, so I should say that by adding the emissions piece, the audit hopefully will provide a baseline and that will be useful. And then I think by adding emissions as part of the RFQ, that helps you, or that incorporates the idea that you're using that for decision making, right? That like you could look across a host of buildings and their audits and say actually like the emissions from this building are a big problem and we want to focus our energies there. I think what's trickier is, as you said, like how are you translating emission savings into dollars necessarily for that longer term contract? And that I think is actually a really tricky question. I don't know that I have an answer for you off the top of my head. Chris, if you have any thoughts on this topic, I'm open to it. But like, I guess the other way to think about it is there are ways that people talk about or quantify, commodify greenhouse gas reductions, savings in other instruments like renewable energy certificate. There are things that exist in the market that find a way to put a dollar value on that. I don't know exactly how much that would translate to like this particular context. So I think that's that would be a really great question that I would want to ask our potential vendors.
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add to that. There's not a cost of carbon right now, unfortunately, and so it's hard to then work that into the plans. What I've seen some folks doing this is largely on the code development side. We put a social cost of carbon on things, so we do a life cycle costing of something, we include that. There's no one who will pay the town of Concord for that savings right now. And so putting it in a contract is not going to help us finance anything, but it should be used as a mechanism to determine whether you want to invest in something.
Choose so Eric. I don't know exactly. I just wanted to, so Wendy Ravelli, I just wanted to play off on that point because, by the way, you did a really nice job modifying that RFQ to embed the emissions in there. And I love that you ask in these audits, show me the savings in dollars, but then separately show it to me in emissions. So certainly we're going to have some good data and make some decision making. But it also seems to me that you're going to throw this contract up in the air. In terms, it's all about savings in dollars and money, right? But when you throw emissions in, it's like a whole new kind of contract. And so my guess is eyes wide open, the audit's going to be fantastic. And then we have another whole new kind of contracting that we're going to have to do. If emissions is where we're going to go. And it sounds like we're going to have a committee to help evaluate not just the RFQ, but sort of then our next steps. Where do you want to contract, right? So it's going to be, I think, a big process with a lot of inputs needed. And it won't all come down to savings, to Janet's point earlier. So, and is there any experience that anyone has around contracting, around the emissions, and any risk arrangements around that you are aware of?
Yeah, so I'm sure this group knows, City of Boston, other municipalities have sort of building emissions reduction, disclosure, the whole ordinance is set up for how that works and how you might reduce things and how you can potentially offset building reductions through other mechanisms. I have not seen like a particular form of contract that's saying like energy savings on building emissions are being reduced and the dollar value associated with that is X. I think that gets kind of baked into other pieces of the regulatory process and it comes out with your ultimate building design usually.
But it comes down to our goals and what we want, so.
Is there sort of a break point in the sort of spectrum of savings? Such that if you don't get those savings, they would actually have to pay you back.
Yes, so
That's interesting.
yes, we would have some set agreement about what the guarantee is in terms of energy savings. And I'm thinking here purely about the energy piece of it, not necessarily the emissions piece of it. But typically you would have a guarantee, and then as part of a contract, it's happens in lots of different energy contracts, there's a shortfall payment that's identified. So you negotiate that for whatever delta there is between what I bargained for and what I got, there's a dollar value associated with that the contractor would have to pay you if you're not realizing the savings that you thought you would.
Yeah, like. I'm just extrapolating from what I know about healthcare. It sounds crazy. If you make an agreement with a party that you're gonna save X number of dollars, and then you're gonna split the savings 50-50, but you don't, say there's no savings at all, the contractor ends up eating that fee, they have to give it back to you, basically, do I have that right?
So
50-50?
yeah, I think all of this involves a little bit of shared risk and shared loss. And the idea is that we'll have a guarantee. It might be a modest guarantee from the contractor if they're sort of being conservative about what they're going to actually be able to realize. And then we would have some measure of saying, you didn't give us what we wanted to get out of this, we need to be paid accordingly. There are always some carve-outs like, acts of God and storms, and so that's certain things which I think actually the built environment won't apply quite so much, but there are always going to be caveats about why people might not be able to meet certain guarantees. But I think that the negotiation of all of those different savings and how they break down is going to be a big part of these longer contracts.
Sounds like fun.
I am Eric Dahlberg from the Finance Committee. If we were to hold it at the audit stage, you mentioned a break fee.
Yes.
Can you give a ballpark sense of what that would look like in dollars?
I don't have a dollar amount in mind. I think what we would want to do is when picking out the buildings that you list that you would want audits for, you would want to figure out some rough amount of what you think an appropriate break fee for each of those would be. So a bigger building is going to have more complexity to it, probably more expensive in terms of that vendor's time to think about it. Or historical buildings, right, where you might want to do certain things, but you're really constrained in terms of what you can touch within that building, might be a little bit more complicated. So I don't have like a set break fee dollar amount, but whatever we did, we would want to make sure that finance folks were certainly comfortable with that, so that if it came down to that and we said, you know what, this isn't working for us, this doesn't make sense, we want to think further about this, that whatever that cost is, that folks would feel comfortable about it. And Eric and Megan, I think you had talked about there is some measure in the budget that would address those break fees, potentially.
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot.
I think, well, that's a discussion that needs to happen, given the fact that if we're talking about all buildings, including school buildings, and again, we're talking about separate budgets, I think there still needs to be some conversations that have to happen at the leadership level about what exactly that might look like. I think you could probably, maybe Russ is gonna shut me down real quick here. I think you could probably get some very rough estimates for the cost of audit, just like per square foot, from some of these companies that might be able to give you a ballpark. I don't know how much that might vary from company to company, but if we needed to get some rough numbers, we could probably get some rough numbers around that. I would say that based on my limited experience, originally the 100,000 that we set aside from ARPA funds to initially try to do this would not have covered all of our municipal buildings. That would not have been enough. We probably would have had to pick and choose. I think if I remember correctly, I think in the Salem RFQ, and I can't remember exactly how many buildings they had included in that, but I think they had provided a number in the RFQ saying, we have 175,000 budgeted.
Oh, that's right, Eric, I forgot that.
And so I don't know exactly how that would compare to us in terms of, without looking at number of buildings and size of buildings. But for Salem, they felt like, and I think they included a good number of their buildings, municipal buildings, including their schools, that as of 2022, that 175,000, they felt covered a good chunk of that for them. So.
Yeah, so Eric, when I was in Clinton, we did a middle school, it was 85,000 for one building. So,
As the break fee?
excuse me?
It's an audit.
As the break fee, or,
The investment grade audit cost 85,000. And that is the number we pay back if we can go ahead and do it.
but if we do go ahead and do it, what does it cost us?
That cost is built into the contracts moving forward
That's negotiated.
and or negotiated at a lower rate. But that was a large school of the size of our high school. So if we extrapolate out, don't hold me to it, but the town would probably be, the investment grade audits might run 350,000.
I do have two other quick questions. This sounds like a pretty hands-on contract. This isn't something where we could just set the vendor loose and they can check back in 6 months. Do we have a plan for staff to manage this contract and manage this vendor? Do we have resources in mind?
Well, that's a discussion that needs to happen as well. So what's often suggested, in my understanding, is that these contracts have an OPM associated with them, and so that technically could be someone in-house, or it could be somebody that gets hired. From what I've heard from other communities, they have valued having somebody in that position for just the reason you're mentioning, which is this is a big animal and you want to make sure that you're staying on top of it and keeping an eye on it, and it does need a certain level of management that goes along with it. So that is a good point.
And my last question is the audits, I don't know anything about this, the audits themselves, how disruptive are they to operations? Are they done, are these folks gonna have to go into schools during the school day and disrupt classrooms and open up the walls and stuff like that, or is it done through documentation review? What do the audits look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I'll start and then Chris, I'm sure, has some pieces to fill in. So there's a lot of just desktop analysis that I think can occur from energy bills, as-built plans that you might have for a building. So our hope would be to have that done ahead of time, and that doesn't need to be anybody in the building. I'm sure someone's going to need to see the building and do a little bit of assessment there. When I've worked on projects in schools, we've always been very clear that whatever work is being done for renewables projects or other building work cannot interrupt the school day. They're people going about their daily operations and what they need to do comes first and foremost, and then sometimes we schedule around that for other things. But Chris, I don't know if you have other experience.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A lot of it is actually just looking at the utility consumption. And so a big part of the effort is benchmarking, understanding how a building is consuming energy and comparing it to similar types of buildings. Is it high or is it low? And another thing you're trying to do is identify what are the end uses. So you've got a bill that says I've got this many kilowatt hours a year, but what's going to lighting versus heating, cooling versus elevators, let's say. And so Some of that you can actually look at in the utility data, depending on the granularity of the utility data. You can start to look for things in that. And then it always would involve some visits to the site. And so that maybe walk through typical spaces. You're typically not doing a lot of destructive testing. You're not digging into walls. You look at plans and things that they're available, but looking at windows and the state of maintenance and then non-specific equipment. A lot of it is just going around and visually saying, okay, there's a pump and it's 20 horsepower and it's got a variable speed drive and it's 30 years old and this is how it might be running. If there's sub-metering data that's available in the building, they'll look at that. If not, they may set up temporary sub-metering. So that again would be something that happens in an electric room or a mechanical space, not in the spaces that are typically occupied. So when I've ever done these audits, they've often been done in buildings that are in full operation. It's not terribly disruptive. You don't need to turn things on and off or things like that. Obviously in school, we want to make sure we know who's going into the school and when they're doing it. It's all no rules.
Hi, Pamela Dritt, Concord Green. So the contractor is like a consultant that we're paying for their managerial and contract running skills and they're guaranteeing that those skills are good enough to save us enough money so that it's worth them doing it for us. So that the company and our interests are aligned because their pay depends on how well they do it for us. But the projects themselves we pay for, i.e. they identify a project that's going to save a lot of money. They don't pay for that project, do they? Or do they? Is that in how we pay them back? So that we don't have, is it like when you let a company put solar panels, lease your roof so that you're leasing them versus buying them? What do we pay versus what they make through savings?
Yeah, so my understanding is it depends in part on, the projects within the contract, the individual projects, how much savings are realized as part of that project, and then those savings get factored into whatever financing option you would choose and go forward with. So, we may take out a loan and take on debt, or there could be some, capital lease where, they're actually owning the equipment and we're leasing it until a certain point and then we take ownership of it. So there's a number of different models, but regardless of which way you're financing it, those projected energy savings and cost savings that are associated with them are getting factored into whatever that model is as part of the payment. And there can be multiple projects within the contract that are happening simultaneously, so these are all sort of getting factored together.
So they're project by project.
Yeah, so what happens is when they come up with a list of energy conservation measures, there'll be suggested timelines associated with that, and we're looking at that and we're saying, well, here's the suggested projects or conservation measures. How do those fit in with our priorities? How do those fit in with our budget and our spending and our timeline? And so we sort of look at all that and go back and forth with them on the contract with that. And then, but we have latitude to, some degree to pick and choose, which projects we want to prioritize or do or not do. So that's all part of the negotiation.
So is there a number of projects that we would do, assuming that we don't want to have the break off after they've done the audit? But we don't want to do all of the projects immediately. Is that a penalized thing, or do we have the flexibility to do that?
It's not penalized to my knowledge. I think obviously there'd be some projects that we want to identify as priorities that we'd like to be ready to move forward with. But I don't think there's an expectation that we need to do everything they're suggesting in a short time frame. That wouldn't be realistic for us to try to take that on. I don't think there's that expectation either.
And do we limit the scope at the beginning by say picking the buildings that we want to be included in this or not? Or is that what we do?
Yeah, so what I've heard and been told is that you should cast a wide net in terms of the RFQ. So you want to include things in there because you can always pull things back, but you can't easily add things in terms of a contract. So, for example, I think it's probably been at least like 10 or 11 years now that the town of Wayland has done an ESCO, and initially they didn't include their town hall building in it. And that ultimately needed a bunch of work, so they had to go back, renegotiate the contract, include that, and it was some time and effort. So I think it probably behooves us to look carefully at what we're going to include, but err on the side of including things with knowing that we can always take away rather than have to add.
And what about buildings like anything in MCI, like the classic old building there, and like Peabody School?
Yeah, so make sure people
Sorry, Eric,
can
if
hear
you,
me. That's okay.
if you want to jump here, you can.
That's okay. So yeah, but that brings up a good point, is the fact that, I think it's well known that, the town is playing a little bit of a strategic chess game right now with our buildings and our resources and potential acquisitions. We know we need new facilities in some cases. Public Works, Public Safety have needs beyond where they are right now. Then things like potential acquisition of NCI, what does that mean for potential town operations, any part of that property? So I know Megan and others in this room are thinking a lot about that in that effort. So that's obviously something we want to keep in mind as part of this. I mean, there may be buildings that we know we don't necessarily want to include just because we know we really don't want to invest in those, and it doesn't make financial sense to make significant investments in those at this point. So that's all part of this conversation too, is trying to figure out how some of these different efforts dovetail. But I wanted to mention just, sorry, I have my phone with me because I'm taking a couple notes. I want to just mention a few things that have crossed my mind as people have been making comments, and that was one of them, which is that just thinking about future needs, and like you were saying, things like the Peabody School. I know there's sort of differing opinions about, is that something we want to invest in and keep, or is that something we should part with and move on? So yeah, all that needs to get factored in. And then I wanted to mention, which maybe was implicit, but one of the reasons that I think this particular model and contract appeals to communities is that they don't necessarily have to put up a lot of capital up front, which is limiting for smaller communities to have to do that. So I think there's some appeal in that. I think that's certainly an appeal for the schools, knowing how there was constraints there with capital budget and a lot of building needs there. So that's certainly a piece that is an appeal. And then also factoring in and making sure we give consideration to the fact that we're a light plant community. So we have electric rates that are a little different than other communities. So how does that factor into our advantage or disadvantage as we're looking forward at energy costs and projected energy costs and savings and things like that. And one other thing I wanted to mention before I forget, because I know we're getting close to what I was suggesting would be the time here, is that there's going to be, obviously we're looking for input here, from some stakeholders and others in terms of the RFQ. But I don't want people to get super hyper focused on the RFQ and not realize that there'll be opportunities beyond the RFQ once we've just hopefully identified a vendor, to have continued input as a community on projects and how those get prioritized and selected and determined. So there's a lot of different voices coming from a lot of different perspectives, and so we want to make sure those are represented. So we'll need to be thinking and talking about what that looks like if we do move forward with this in terms of how projects get determined, and making ensure that all the stakeholder voices have some input into that process. So.
I think there's at least 2 questions that I saw.
Okay, so I just want to make sure we get around the room for a few more questions.
Thanks. I have a couple comments and questions. The first pertains to the list of buildings and the comments that you wouldn't necessarily do an audit on all the buildings. So that presents a potential issue. Let me explain. One of the advantages of doing these audits and in the financial sense is that it allows us to plan ahead for major expenses. And that becomes significant because, if we're planning to replace if we know a boiler is going to go out in 5 years, we have capital assigned for that already in that time frame. And the shock to the system of having to replace a boiler is lessened because we've planned for it. And when we do that, we can more easily incorporate emission savings features and energy savings features. So I would suggest that the one way to cull the list without much risk is say that any building under 5 years old, we're not going to audit, because on a capital expense perspective, there shouldn't be much need for a while. But on the other hand, pretty much everything after that list should be considered so that we don't get surprises.
Would the high school be included? Because
The high school probably should be included in the audit.
should be.
So Ellen Garrison's school not,
Yeah.
as an example. On a different note, the reports from the investment grade audit, I'm hoping, and I was hoping to see something in the draft, but I didn't see it, perhaps I missed it. I think one of the deliverables should be multiple options for achieving the energy savings and emission goals on each project. So I'm concerned because when I looked at the draft originally, I didn't see anything about specifics on that kind of a deliverable. And while it is, I think, somewhat standard in these energy service organizations to provide that information, contractually, I don't want to rely on not having it listed. So could you comment on, did I miss that in there, or is it not in there yet?
So I'm looking while we're talking, and first of all, I liked your suggestion about figuring out like an age of buildings, or a way for us to say like how do we, sort through some of this buildings list here. I thought that was really thoughtful. I believe, and I'm looking for it, but I'm not able to put my hands on it just this very second, but your point about optionality I think is a very good one. I think we have something about that in there. But right, there's no one perfect way that we're looking for to solve this. We're looking for maybe a few different strategies for a building, and maybe one makes more sense than the other, or one gets us, a lot of bang for our buck. There's also different trade-offs that you might think about. So yes, I think that's in the draft. I just can't put my precise finger on it right now, but I agree with you.
Okay, great. And lastly, I just want to make a comment. I'm on the Climate Action Committee, and I raised the issue in our last meeting about the lack of emissions being in the document. I see that that's been worked in many places, and I want to thank all of you for being attentive and responsive to my comments.
We're happy to help.
Thanks.
Thank you. I know this is oriented towards buildings, but there's some systems that really need, I think, to be included. For example, the school bus fleet, the electrification and charging facilities for that is a very important thing that the town must do, and can save significant money for benefiting both the contractor that eases the transition issues, particularly because the infrastructure hasn't been built yet but needs to be built. Can that be included? Also, we are recognizing that all of these things are going to be all electric, no gas, correct? Because of the stretch codes and the fact that our town is in the 10 communities.
The pilot, yeah.
Yeah,
I think, so I wanna, sorry, I want you to finish your question and I have thoughts.
well, I have a little list of them, but can any semi-private groups like First Parish Church, which is embarking on a massive greening project, get involved with this? And where is the draft? Someplace that I could read?
Well, we weren't sharing the draft publicly at this point. We were just sharing it among staff and the relevant committees. I think as we get closer to refining the draft, I mean, I'll defer to council to determine when, more broadly, we can make that more available publicly. But so just I'll adjust a couple things real quick. I haven't heard or not aware of anything related to, like you were talking about, the electric school buses and infrastructure around that. A lot of this focuses on existing buildings and making retrofits and upgrades to the efficiency of existing buildings. So we're not really talking about new buildings. New buildings would be captured under our bylaws, the fossil fuel-free bylaw. So
Well, there is, for instance, the building that the maintenance and the storage and the repairs of the school buses, that exists.
yeah, so
And there is associated with that, the charging infrastructure, which is apparently the roadblock to expanding the electric school bus fleet. And every time we buy another GAP diesel bus, that's a decade of fossil fuel infrastructure we're supporting.
Yeah, well, I think, it's certainly something I can look into to see if there's any examples of that anywhere else, or whether it's something that would
It would be a good
traditionally
thing
fit into
to
something like
have,
this.
because it would benefit not just our community, but the
Yeah,
whole country.
but the bus depot, that building, I would imagine something like that would likely be included in the audits, although again, we need to sort of figure out what the scale and scope of the audits is gonna be, but if that's one of the school buildings that's included and they're interested in having that assessed, then that's, certainly something we can consider adding to that, so.
And the all electric, no gas?
So the fossil fuel-free bylaws for new construction, major renovations, so I think it would depend on the scale of the renovations, but that's also an interesting thing that, I think we need to look at and consider in the context of this is, our obligations to electrify our municipal buildings under that versus, this contract and sort of how do those dovetail. But your other question is that this is really just limited to municipal buildings, so things like First Parish and other properties would not be included in this.
I really want to know because I don't want to, no gas infrastructure should be included in this, period.
Okay, well, again, that depends on, I think, on the scale of the project, so.
I don't think so, like for instance,
I mean, I'll just jump in. So I think the type of vendor who would be someone that we would want to select for this would be somebody who would be smart and understand that Concord is a town that is thinking about things in a non-fossil fuel context. So with respect to like a specific project, I don't know that there's any specific thing that we could mention, but let me put it this way: if a vendor comes in and is not sensitive to that topic, I think that's somebody that might not be ultimately selected. Chris, I see your hand up.
So, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think when you look at what comes out of an audit, there are going to be measures that are proposed that will be addressing existing gas equipment and looking at reducing gas consumption. I think you want to include those kinds of things. Something as simple as we're going to turn down the thermostats to save gas. We want to do that. when it comes time to replace a major piece of equipment, then I think that's where you look at that very carefully and say, we want to do that. We don't want to invest in another 20 years of fossil fuels, but if we can, we're currently using fossil fuels, and if we have a way to reduce that consumption, then that's a beneficial thing to do right now.
Yeah, but we want to guarantee that we will not build out.
Yeah, well, you know, I think that's something that then you look at in the context of this,
Yeah.
what comes out of the audits, and, you know, I think separate from audits perhaps, but informed by that, is a long-term plan of how you convert existing buildings to being all electric, if they're not currently.
Is it
That's
the
not necessarily
Alcott's?
something that would get done as part of a performance contract with us.
Right,
Well,
so,
like, isn't it the Alcott school that currently is boilers dying? And they were gonna replace it, but now we've said we've gotta do heat pump. Was that the
Yes.
right school?
so I'll just jump in. I think one of the things that we first talked about was the idea that like moving forward with this concept or issuing this RFQ doesn't, set in stone anything about what's happening to any particular buildings. Like the piece that's being moved forward here is finding a person to help us evaluate the issue, and the outcome of that is an audit, which isn't necessarily telling us to do any one thing or another, or making any value choices for us about what makes sense for a project or a particular building. It's just helping us understand a baseline, and then figure out, which buildings, which projects are the real places where we want to focus our energy. So I fully appreciate that you're thinking ahead to like what makes sense and what projects are priorities, and I think it's absolutely part of the sort of life cycle of this whole multi-step process. But for this particular moment, I think we're really just trying to figure out who's the person who's gonna help us move forward with that.
And so I just want to be sensitive to time here, because I think we said we would go till about 7:15, and I know the library needs to come in and wrap things up before they need to start shutting things down. But I do appreciate everybody's attendance here and involvement and perspectives. You know, we're going to continue this conversation. This RFQ is one step in the process. We're going to do our best to make sure that our interests and values and priorities are reflected in this. I think it's going to be interesting to see what DOER and the state think, assuming that we continue to go forward with some emissions language there. On one hand, I think they're very supportive of looking at emissions reductions. On the other hand, this is a tested model that, as we said, has been around for a long time, and there's industries that have been built up around it. So the idea of throwing a little bit of a wrench in there, or tweaking things a little bit, it remains to be seen what that means just yet. But we're gonna do our best and try. And we're also trying to balance that with the fact that ultimately we as a town need to move forward on this, and so we can't necessarily deliberate it forever. We're gonna have to go forward with the RFQ and some version of that, and then see what responses we get, and that's the next step where we get to make more decisions about whether that's a good fit for us and what we're doing. So I want to thank again all of you for coming, council for being here, Chris for being here to help us out, and stay tuned for some more information. We'll certainly keep people updated as we continue to make progress. So thank you.
Great, thank you everyone.
Thanks.